Funding in common, 260 billion. We have 130 public banks that we've brought together. So if we are able to use some of that capacity and move it towards the agricultural sector, I think that that will make the difference, and it will also then mobilize the private sector. Now, I don't want to be too lengthy. The French Development Agency that I'm in charge of has many engineers and has a long experience in terms of funding agriculture, 1.5 billion every year for agriculture. And so we are very much part of this very committed movement and behind IFAD, and also in Morocco. We have many projects in Morocco. The ambassador at large worked with me to transform practices on the ground, strengthening the value chains, the well-being for the population that live from those, and also using local financial institutions. And also there's the Great Green Wall that President Macron mentioned yesterday in the plenary session. Of course, this is a very specific situation in the Sahel, in the Greater Sahel region, and this is the purpose of the Great Green Wall. We have to counter those messages of terrorism that we're hearing in the Sahel, for example, and we have to build a message which is constructive, which is positive, which will aim to do that. It's not just a purpose. Last January, we had 19 billion to invest in this area, and things are moving forward very well. But let's speed things up and let's show what impacts have been achieved. So thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Rioux. Thank you, Director Gilbert Rambaud.
Monsieur le Président, you were...
So I'd like to turn to you.
Summit IFAD, obviously, and Monsieur Rioux mentioned all of the extremely strong and powerful work that your organization is doing, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on some of the most effective initiatives for inclusive and transformative global food systems. For example, I note that this year IFAD aims to increase the incomes of 20 million poor small-scale food producers, 50% of whom are women, by 20%. And perhaps you could speak specifically to the role of smallholders as a critical entry point for the transformation of the system.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for having us today. And bonjour, Rémi. Very pleased to see you. And for your introductory remarks. Of course, the Food Systems Summit, which has been a huge undertake based on the request of the Secretary General Gutierrez, the Food Systems Summit really was an opportunity for us to bring to the front line the key challenge we're having globally in the food system, in the supply chain, or the food system supply chain, but more specifically in the what I call the small-scale producers, those that are producing 2 hectares or less on that. So before I move on, I believe it's important to remind all ourselves that 80% of the world poor live in rural area. And in a region like Africa, still today, 80% of the food is produced by those small-scale farmers. Yet, we know that we do have productivity issue, both labor productivity as well as total factor productivity challenges that we have in the food systems. Particularly knowing very well that 60% of the workforce in the rural area are women. And therefore, it's important for us to really intentionally target the women. So for me, those are kind of key. So the challenge that we are seeing so far is from the food security perspective, looking at it from health perspective in terms of nutrition, looking at it from environmental perspective, protection of the environment. 75% of fresh water is used in agriculture on that, and look at that from economic perspective, because as hard as it is, and those women and men who spend more than 60 hours a week in ag, in farming, yet they are not able to earn $2 a day on that. Those are the challenges we're talking about. Those are where we are about. But so moving forward, we do see, however, a lot of opportunity. You look again in Africa, where $70 billion, this is the import bill for food to Africa. And therefore, COVID has helped us to prove that you can use that and transform that in an economic opportunity, particularly for the youth. So those are all the challenges that we want to move ahead for. So moving ahead, and that's why I really appreciate the leadership of IFAD and Remy in pushing really this public development bank, where we believe there's a strong role that we want to play. So we did in IFAD 2-3 years ago a global study focusing on the youth and the youth in the rural area. And there are two striking findings. One, we know that mostly around the world, the exodus from the rural to the urban area will continue. So the youth in the rural area will go down, except in Africa, where we expect the youth to still be growing in the rural area. Second, if you ask those youth, what is the number one impediment that they have in moving forward, one they will tell you is the financing on that. So in addition to that financing, I will add the technology, the digital. So for us today, if we really want to, you really need to ensure the productivity and therefore having the technology at the service. So there's a lot of hope, and you know that there's a different follow-up initiatives that different colleagues will be leading. And in that perspective, we believe that IFAD, as well as others, have a responsibility, yes. Not just a role, a responsibility. And I want to also, and maybe exactly what Remy did, is link that to what just finished in Glasgow. Because on the adaptation side, and when you talk again about those women and men in the rural area, I mentioned it a few weeks ago, very clearly that the long-term solution is the mitigation. And let's be very, very clear. Of course, because the long-term mitigation will only give results 10, 20 years from that to really have the net impact. But today, what our small scale, what the rural people, what the poor people are suffering from is the need for adaptation. Yet, only 2% of the global climate finance goes to adaptation right now. And that, we got to correct that. And even within that meager portion going to adaptation, 1.7% goes to the rural setting. So this is also the other challenge we have to ensure that we bring the adaptation solution as well So only by doing that, and for us, with the financing, with the innovation in the financing, that's where will help us moving in the direction. In IFAD, our target is to double our impact by 2030 and moving into the right direction for the Agenda 2030. Thanks.
Wonderful. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, rather.
I'd like to turn to you now for the pursuit of our discussion, and I'd like to ask you perhaps to speak particularly on what you believe is the true key importance of effective inclusiveness within the food system, and how that fits into the multilateralism space, and how you believe, I understand that it's a driver for change within multilateralism.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Kate Vivian, for your moderation and for the previous speakers. I think that it is obvious that inclusive approaches
Ambassador Bensala, thank you.
have multiple benefits, from putting the human dimension at the core of the whole problem, and of course making the food systems then more sensitive, protection of basic human rights and of the basic human rights of all, the fundamental one, which is the right to food, and which is far from being, of course, implemented, but as well make them really sensitive to the protection of the very basis of agricultural production, which are the resources, which are limited and which are facing competitive claims. And this has been already said about finance, which is critical, for the development of this. I don't want to go into the long list of the benefits of inclusive approaches. They do create dynamic, they do favor intergenerational link, which is absolutely crucial in our regions at least, where you can have a pool of experiences between the traditional ancestral know-how and between innovation and students. And more than that, and much beyond that, it creates as well intertwined connections between the different systems and between different groups, which are living side by side and do not have the opportunity to see each other or to know better each other, and to come with the appropriate local specific solutions to the problems they are facing. And we do know that because, but unfortunately, to really, really get these benefits, this inclusivity, which everybody talks about, has to be effective, has to be genuine, has to be implemented on the ground. And for that, there are a lot of prerequisites to that. It needs to enable all the people, and especially the weakest, and I'm happy that you are mentioning women and the youth, who are really key for food security. But unfortunately, they are the first victim of food insecurity. When I was working on my thesis, I have made a lot of surveys in Africa. So women do provide food security, but they are lacking tremendously this food security, not only for themselves, but for their families. So we have to enable the weakest to be able to participate, to be real actors of their own destiny, not only for themselves, but for their families, for the communities, and for the societies at large. So, of course, this means what? Better education, better training, better information, and, of course, better access to all the necessities, inputs, technology, finance, credit, just name it, to be able to become these vibrant actors that they become when they are given the chance. And paradoxically, we have noticed in Morocco, and I will give just a couple of examples, I don't want to be too long, that paradoxically, inclusive approaches make of the actors more autonomous, more responsible actors. And the feedback for the societies and the rewarding is absolutely huge. And that is really, really important at the period where, unfortunately, the materialism is overshadowing and prevailing on primary solidarities and all type of solidarities. So that's why we are very keen on a global approach which is integrated, and I'm happy that you mentioned, of course, this, because this is absolutely basic. And I give just a couple, of examples which are really emblematic in Morocco, and thank you, Mr. Riou, for mentioning Morocco, and I thank you for what you are doing, in our country. I start by EcoFund, because I'm part of this fund, which is to take care of creating ecosystems in remote, vulnerable, rural areas, which are most impacted either by drought, because they have very little rain-fed possibilities, or by climate change. And lately we have we have started a very good experience in Rhamna, and the IFAD is one of our partners, between start-uppers, University Mohammed VI, and the ancestral know-how about the cumin. The cumin, as you know, is a spice which is very much used in Moroccan gastronomy, but as well for therapeutic reasons. And it is absolutely impressive to see all this different group of people working together and creating this best practices exchange. It is just starting, but we are very ambitious and we are very hopeful that this will create the benefits that we really look for. First of all, they do consolidate the harmony and the social link, which is unfortunately getting very loose.
Yes.
Second, it does consolidate the exchange of experiences between ancestral knowledge and innovation and research. And it does inject in these territories, which are remote from anything, life. It prevents them from desertification. We are even now trying to combine, and we are much more ambitious because we are to integrate eco-architecture, eco-tourism, and nano-irrigation, which is absolutely basic for Morocco, and we are starting, it's very high on the agenda, the nano-irrigation, you know, for such things. So this eco-fund is extremely, unfortunately, we have little means, that's why we are looking for partners like the IFAD and probably others, Mr. President. So this is really important because it is by the people, for the people, and for better understanding and living together at a period where we see xenophobia and all type, you know, of this hatred, you know, skyrocketing. The second example, of course, doesn't need to be insisted upon, is the emblematic Argan system in Morocco. As you know, this wild tree, which is extraordinarily resistant to all type of extreme temperatures, extreme drought, extreme weather. And it dates back, you know, it's really extremely old, but now we have adapted it and we have planted a number of dozens of hectares for the benefit almost exclusively for women. It is a very hard job, very difficult to do and to address because it's really, really very demanding. But at the same time, it is creating more autonomy for women, and it has multiple benefits for three sectors. Of course, food, because you have now Argan, which is a basic, you know, in a lot and across the world. We are selling a lot of that. But as well for therapeutic virtues and for cosmetics. So women are very interested, and I can tell you that now I'm abandoning a lot of all this prefigurated and working just with argan oil and the natural orange blossom and so forth. But what's really interesting is the cooperatives which have emerged from this, and the number of researchers who have been attracted and who came back to Morocco, including young women with a lot of diplomas from across the world, and who are coming back now to start new small businesses connected with this ecosystem, because it's getting really, really huge. And perhaps this is the best benefit I would like really, you know, to insist on, is that it is making agriculture more attractive, more rewarding, not only for rural youth to stay on the site and to develop ecotourism and le terroir, les produits du terroir and so forth, but as well for the young with diplomas. And you know, Mr. Prime Minister, that it is our problem in Africa, because we have a lot of unemployment of the educated people. And now we see it. They are going back, you know, to this. That's why it's important as a driver, these food systems. And we see this multiple partnership that University Mohammed VI, for instance, is doing with MIT, Florida Tropical Fruits, Tsukuba University, just name it, French universities, and then doing fundamental research in University Mohammed VI Polytechnic, and 14 outreach centers in Africa for research. It's already making our youth staying in Africa and having a future in their own continent and sometimes their own country. And I think this is probably one of the best things, because we should not ignore that, unfortunately, migration and the problem of climate change is going to make this question even worse, and especially water scarcity. That's why we are really, really anxious to develop these type of things, and especially we make it local specific, because we do know that the real answer to climate change, to sustainable development, come from local work and has to connect with the larger picture, and is carried out by local places, by the cities, which are really vibrant and having much more interest than abstract global things that you do not see.
This is a wonderful transition. Merci beaucoup, Madame l'Ambassadrice.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
You've spoken a lot about the impact on the ground, and I'd love to hear from you, Mick, about global citizens' perspective of grassroots, ground-up advocacy in working towards these goals.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you to the Paris Peace Forum. Thank you, Mr. Remy. Thank you, President Gilbert, Ambassador. It's an honor to be on this panel with you. Yeah, I think people often ask, why is Global Citizen? We've been partnered with IFAD now for the last 5 years, and we're a movement of millions of activists around the world campaigning for a world without extreme poverty. Why do we care? And the reality is 2/3 of those living in rural communities across Africa, living in rural poverty, are farmers. And IFAD is the only multilateral organization dedicated exclusively to rural poverty. And so from my perspective, this really goes to the heart of our mission. Now earlier, President Gilbert mentioned the fact that, these smallhold farmers account for 80% of all food supply across Africa. They account for something like 40% of all jobs across sub-Saharan Africa, and yet farmers are not getting the support they need. They're on the front lines of climate change. Almost 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to travel with IFAD's Goodwill ambassadors, Idris and Sabrina Alba, and I went to a community in Sierra Leone, and I saw the impact firsthand of farmers who were having their yield crops decline dramatically, double-digit percentage-wise, because they could no longer predict rainfall. They didn't have the support, and of course, you're seeing droughts, extreme weather events caused by climate change, and the support isn't there for these farmers, and yet they're so crucial if we want to end extreme poverty, if we want to feed the world, and of course, agriculture is so significant to addressing climate change as well. So to your question, what are we going to do about it? Well, the first thing is we need countries to increase their support for organizations like IFAD. I applaud the government of France. Earlier this year, President Macron announced that he would increase their support by 50%. And last month at our Global Citizen Live, the Kingdom of Morocco also announced that they would be contributing. So thank you, Ambassador, for your support. But we need other countries to step up. And it's telling that the host of COP26, this is now the very last few hours of that climate summit on the other side of the channel. The host still hasn't pledged, and yet they want to send a signal that they stand in solidarity with the world. They said this would be a solidarity COP. Well, surely one of the best things you can do is stand in solidarity with those on the front lines and make this commitment. The second thing is this is slightly wonky, and we've heard a lot about the IMF special drawing rights, but there is now over 600 billion special drawing rights issued through the course of this year. Now, again, I applaud France. They announced that they would recycle 20% of these to the pandemic recovery efforts. We're still waiting to see the follow-through on where this goes, but we need other countries to step up, particularly, other G7 countries, the United States and Japan in particular. And again, IFAD is an official designated holder of SDRs. They could receive this and put it to use right now, as President Gilbert said, to double their impact over the next decade. And finally, what about our billionaires as well? We saw private wealth soar throughout the pandemic. And for those watching, there's been an online Twitter exchange between David Beasley of the World Food Programme, and Elon Musk, he talks about the fact that they now have 45 million people on the brink of starvation. You know, this is not a huge amount. The dollars we're talking about, relatively speaking, are a fraction of GDP for the G20. Private wealth has soared, and frankly, the US military budget is $700 billion a year annually itself, and yet this would do so much for security. And so finally, you know, when it comes to what are we doing about this, this is where we all have a voice. And I think sometimes, you know, we come to summits like this and we geek out on issues like climate change, and we forget that if you take a country like the United States, only 12% of people are said to be talking about climate change at any one time. And so this is where we need to be bold in our conversations. We need to communicate and have this with the public. It's why a month ago, Global Citizen staged Global Citizen Live, actually right here in Paris with Elton John and Ed Sheeran in front of the Eiffel Tower. But we need more of that. We need to mainstream these issues, as you said, Ambassador, to engage people and get them contacting their governments to hold up the promises we've all made to the world's most vulnerable communities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mick, for that. Thank you to all speakers today. We have time for just a couple of questions, so I'd like to quickly go to the list that I've received here from people who are listening to us around the world today. Perhaps the first question, which is perhaps more for Monsieur Ngwo and Monsieur Rioux, but everybody, of course, is welcome to, is a question on how, and we touched on it a few times, but how essential you believe technological development and transformation is for transforming the global food system. What's the space of technology and its innovation in that field? Monsieur Rioux?
Mr. Rioux.
Elle est grande, évidemment.
It's significant, obviously. I think that we have existing technology. I was in Glasgow last week, and sticking to the climate objectives for 2030 is possible by mobilizing and harnessing existing technology. I'm thinking about the mitigation of emissions, of course, but I'm also thinking about adaptation. We also need to finance the next wave of innovation. After 2030, so long as the regulations are upheld, we will have to ensure that we bring about other solutions, other technologies, other practices. And I think here we must create a system which undertakes research. We have CIRAD, for example, in France, in Montpellier, which specializes in agricultural research and food systems. And there are others across the globe that create a network. And the movement that Gilbert and myself presented, it's not about advocating development banks, not at all. It's about mobilizing them, creating platforms that enable them to provide the right type of finance, the right type of research, and adapted technologies. A lot still remains to be done in this respect. International action, I think, is expected and also necessary in terms of innovation for agriculture. Thank you very much, Mr. Rioux. Thank you for that. Yes, just to add to what Rémi just said, as it relates to technology, I will say quite simply, without the technology, we will not reach our objectives by 2030, particularly SDGs 1 and 2. That is clear. And this is for several reasons. Let's take a look at land management, first of all, and the ability of farmers to be able to measure the rate of humidity and the quantity of water that crops require. There is also the issue of enhanced seeds as well. Earlier on, I mentioned the 70 billion in terms of food imports. And this is simply wheat. That costs a significant amount. However, if we can enhance seeds, many African countries can produce their own wheat. Sudan is an example of this. The African Development Bank is working with that country, and this would enable an increase in production, but also it will make it possible to reduce the cost of importing foodstuffs. It's also important to accumulate data that will make it better to carry out better forecasts and better innovation. I'm thinking in particular of our ability to reduce insurance premiums against adverse weather events. So we need innovation in this respect. There is also a need for access to markets and access to finance. The World Bank and the African Development Bank and IFAD are working on this particular issue. Thank you very much.
Question, and I have one that is a little bit more dedicated to you, Mick, and to Ambassador Ben Salah. We have a question on your opinion as to what the main mechanisms are for ensuring participation of ancestral knowledge, so of indigenous people, in terms of food security and in terms of transforming the food system. So something, Ambassador Ben Salah, please.
I think it's a global question. It's a question of governance and delivery. We have to become more credible on this aspect at large, but particularly as far as justice is concerned, and to have a recourse and to be able to be reached and to be listened to. That's what the youth want to be. They want to be part of this community and count. That's why it's important to have these inclusive approaches, and certainly the education system is absolutely crucial and critical, and unfortunately it's not functioning properly all across the developing countries. And it is true as well that we need to have politics to be closer to the populations. And that's why I have given you the example, because, for instance, what the territorial authorities are doing in Morocco to coordinate, they are the real chief of the orchestra, because they put together all these multi-objective, multi-stakeholders, different partnerships from all over the country and from all over the world, because we have a lot of funders who come from the international sphere as well, and different cultures. A rural peasant is not like a young student of the university, very sophisticated and very much the head in the clouds, you know, with MIT and, you know, the best universities in the world. So that's really important, is to deliver, to become credible and to be closer. And this is an opportunity as well for the politics to become more credible, closer to the people, and really live out the devastating, compensatory speech, all these slogans. That's why inclusive approaches are important, but they have to be credible and they have to be genuine. Otherwise, it doesn't work, because the youth, now with all the social networks, with all these things, they do not believe in many things. And on the contrary, they are just ready to criticize and to destroy.
Mick, I'm sure that speaks very much to you in terms of the voice of activists and mobilizing that community.
Well, I think two points I'd make is, you know, it's interesting, you know, in the context of COP26, you know, things are dire, and you know, there's been a lot of research published in recent months about the damage that climate change will cause. But I genuinely believe when fear is used too much in our campaign and our storytelling, it can drive people to a state of apathy and hopelessness. And reality is one of the best ways to actually inspire people is to look at some of those local stories of progress. And in those indigenous communities, there's amazing stories. And I think it's a real shame that, you know, I was at COP26 last week, and it could be just because there was so much going on, so much noise. But these stories of progress, I mean, I stumbled across, you know, a group of Native American in the Action Hub in the summit, and they were sharing these stories about what they were doing, how they were defending their communities, standing up, and it was inspiring. And the second point I would make is, you know, we as a community of advocates, particularly those, you know, who have the privilege to be able to, you know, not look over our shoulder every time we speak, you really need to stand up for environmental defenders and activists everywhere. You know, in some communities around the world, such as the Amazon in Brazil, you know, it's borderline criminal what is going on. And I think ultimately we know citizen-led accountability is key to the delivery of all of these promises. We need a safe civic space. We need to make sure those voices are heard, that they're not prosecuted for speaking truth to power.
Yes, absolutely. Wonderful, strong words to finish today's panel. I'd like to thank you all four of you for being here. Merci beaucoup à vous tous, et merci.
Thank you very much to everyone, and thank you to all of those who have joined us across the globe today. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Goodbye.